Today we are going to talk about the political formation of the Swedish state. As I said, we are only going to talk about the political formation, therefore we are going to jump in very late, comparatively late in history, because early events mainly changed the borders of Sweden, not the political system. So we're going to start right at the end of the Kalmar Union. After the bloodbath of Stockholm in 1520, a rebellion under Gustav Vasa sparked for the Swedish independence, and which led to the Swedish War of Liberation in 1521 to 1523, which Sweden ended up winning and therefore becoming independent. However, Sweden got help from the city of Lübeck, which resulted in high debt towards Lübeck. Also, Sweden was only allowed to trade with Lübeck back then, and it took Sweden until 1535 in another war to get full economic independence. As I said, Sweden had high debt, and to change that, Gustav Vasa forced the Catholic Church to give up some of their treasures. And that was not the only thing he did to weaken the Catholic Church, because Gustav Vasa basically wanted to control everything. So it was pretty convenient for him that at that time the Reformation under Martin Luther started. And basically what Martin Luther wanted is that the church and the state should be two different things, and the church therefore should not have a lot of political influence. So Gustav Vasa quickly adopted Lutheranism. However, the people of Sweden adjusted very slowly. It took them decades, and also several uprisings and rebellions happened against the way that Gustav Vasa disempowered the Catholic Church in Sweden. What followed after his death in 1560 is that his descendants ruled over Sweden, and there were a lot of wars. I just wrote down two here, which is the Livonian Wars, where Sweden gained some territories in the east, and the 30 Years' War, which was a huge war in Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. However, all those wars, and there were a lot of them, mainly resulted in Sweden expanding, as you can see on the map, and didn't really change a lot of political stuff. So we're going to just skip that part. At last, I want to talk about the Riksdag, which is not the one we have today. It is the Riksdag of the four estates, which were the four estates being nobility, the clergy, the burghers, and the farmers. It was first called in 1435, basically to support the king and to assure him that the people would be all right, would be fine with this policy. And from then on, it was called in irregular intervals, mostly in times where, in bad times, where the king needed help. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Lucas. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking about the 18th and 19th century Sweden. The era starts with the Age of Freedom, which is from 1718 to 1772. Here we see a shift in the political power from the royalty to the parliament. 18th century is also known as the golden age of trade and commerce in Sweden, wherein there is a lot of rapid socio-cultural development that takes place. Farmers gain their right to own farmlands. There is an increasing expansion in trade that we see. And it is not only a period of financial boom, but there's also an increase in the scientific temperament of the Swedish population, with a lot of important innovations taking place around at this time. But soon, with the outbreak of Napoleonic War, as we enter the 19th century, all of this is put to a halt, and with the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 between Russia and France, Sweden declares a war against France. Denmark also sides with France, and that leaves Sweden politically isolated from east, west, and south side. The war ends in 1809, but Napoleon gains considerable hegemony over the Swedish throne. Also important would be to mention here that in this war, Sweden completely loses Finland to Russia. And that is how we have Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's marshal, being designated as the Crown Prince of Sweden in 1810. Being Napoleon's marshal, Bernadotte knew all the weaknesses of Napoleonic Empire, and instead of siding with Napoleon, however, and taking forward Napoleon's political agenda, Bernadotte, or Charles John, as he was later named as, he actually sought alliance with Napoleon's enemies. He changed the face of Swedish politics by doing so, and soon we had the Treaty of Kiel in 1814, which led to Sweden gaining full control of Norway from Denmark. However, even Charles John's fierce political policies couldn't stop Sweden from entering into financial crisis, and a slump in the economy is seen given the Napoleonic Wars, restrictive trade policies, regulations, etc. This is also known as the conservative era, which lasted till about 1840. This also resulted in huge emigration from Sweden to North America during about mid-19th century, and all of this led to a massive demand for reforms. And then we have liberal and parliamentary reforms from 1840s till about late 1860s, and we see huge liberal and parliamentary reforms taking place. Amongst other things, it included compulsory school education, abolition of guilds to pave way for industrial and trade associations, lifting of ban from import and export, equal inheritance right for men and women, and most importantly, the introduction of local self-government in Sweden. In the parliamentary reforms, we see the old format of Riksdag being done away with and is replaced by two chambers, where we have upper chamber and the second chambers. Members in the upper chamber are elected from indirect vote, and the members in the second chamber are elected through direct popular vote, and we see a lot of farmer representation there. During the late 19th century, that is from 1860s onwards, we see a stagnation in Swedish political arena. However, it is during this period that important Swedish political party came into being, like the Swedish Social Democratic Party, the Liberal Union, Conservative Party, which was later renamed as the Moderate Party. Some of these parties still hold importance in the Swedish politics. As we slowly enter towards the 20th century, we see changes in the Swedish alliance policy. Sweden adopted a friendly attitude towards the Western powers, with the signing of the November Treaty in 1855 and a peace treaty in Paris, which soon followed. Sweden, as such, held a neutral stance throughout the wars that were ongoing between different countries, whether it was the war between Prussia and Austria in 1866 or the war between Germany and France in 1870-71. So starting 1870s onwards, we see Sweden holding on to a neutral position as we enter the 20th century, and Emma would be taking forward.
Thank you, Ankita. So as we start the 20th century, we see the dissolution of the union between Sweden and Norway. This happens in 1905. This was very much on Norway's part, as they were no longer interested in Sweden's trade partners, nor their so-called conservative stance on having a king. Norway was trying to do away with that. The workers' strike in 1909 leads to more men being able to vote, specifically those who had completed their military service and who paid taxes. These workers voted in a liberal socialist government. However, in 1914, this government was disbanded by the king after the Farmers' March petitioned for a more conservative government that was more pro-war in response to the liberal socialist government anti-war policies. This led to a very conservative government, especially in the first chamber. However, this government did remain neutral during World War I. Post-World War I, we see women gaining the right to vote in 1919 and voting for the first time in the 1921 election. However, between 1920 and 1933, we see many short-lived governments and regularly changing leadership. Out of the 10 leaders from this period, only about 5 of them lasted for more than a year. So the Social Democrats come into power officially in 1933, and they maintained this power until 1976, creating the so-called welfare state. However, many private capitalists were worried about the role a socialist government would play in private capital. So the 1938 Saltsjöbaden Agreement allowed for private capital to continue to exist in Sweden, which appeased these groups, and allowed for the Social Democrats to stay in power as long as they did. Under the welfare state, we see many changes in human rights. Firstly, in labor rights with the 1936 8-hour working day, and in 1938, 2 weeks of yearly vacation, which would increase over the rest of the century. We also see a lot of changes in terms of housing and gender rights. For example, in 1938, artificial birth control was legalized. And in the 1960s and 70s, we see the Million Program, which was a housing program developing 1 million houses for unhoused Swedish people. We see public childcare be introduced, and we see legislation against violence in the home, especially against children and wives. As we approach the late 20th century, it's important to note that in the 50s and 60s, due to the war, Swedish industry was booming as they were one of the few countries that still had industries. However, by the 70s, increased global competition led to a huge decline in Swedish industries, especially when combined with the economic crisis at the time. This downturn lasted throughout the 70s and into the mid-80s, but there was a slight peak again, and then it crashed again. And in the 90s, many Swedish people were kind of concerned about the welfare state and how the state was going to continue funding these social programs. Franklin will bring you into the 21st century now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the 21st century marks the dates from 1st January 2001 up to date. Yeah, and in beginning the year 2000, there was a massive conversions in folkhemmet, and the Swedish central government allowed the provinces and municipalities to provide economic requirements to the individuals. In 2006, the moderates managed to win when Fredrik Reinfeldt was the chairperson of the party. In 2008, the Lisbon Treaty was approved. Yeah, but still the Swedes did not vote, to use the euros. Yeah. During 2008 to 2009, Sweden was affected intensely by the crisis of economic, and during this period, Sweden was characterized with the high rate of unemployment and the high tax rate. In 2009, the Swedish government allowed the same-sex marriage basing on the gender-neutral law on marriage. In 2010, the four-party center-right alliance chaired by Reinfeldt, together with the coalition, decided to form a government. Yeah, they decided to form a minority government, and Reinfeldt still managed to be the prime minister. For the first time, the non-socialists won elections in the Swedish history. In 2010, the Swedish government banned on the compulsory joining of the Swedish military service. Yeah, and in 2013, Sweden experienced some unpeaceful demonstrations. Yeah, from the migrants, because there was a man who had been killed by the police. Yeah, and the immigrants thought that the Swedish police had actually violated their human rights. In 2014, the Social Democratic Party and the Greens formed a minority association. Yeah, they formed a minority association which was led by Stefan Löfven before he had resigned. And from 2018 to 19 also, the Liberal and Center parties supported the minority coalition. Yeah, as I had said earlier, the minority coalition comprised of the Greens and the Social Democrats, and they supported the minority coalition to form the minority government with Stefan Löfven again as the prime minister. From 2020 to date, the Swedish government has been fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, and during 2020 also, the Swedish government acquitted the murder case of the former prime minister. Yeah, because there was lack of enough evidence to support that that the prime minister had actually been killed. Up to now, Sweden is actually a neutral country, a peaceful country, most loved globally. Yeah, it is amongst the best countries in the world.
So in conclusion, the Swedish state we have today is very different from the Swedish state we saw under Gustav Vasa. The early modern period was characterized by costly wars, unequal political representation, and a lot of religious change. Even in the 18th and 19th century, where we see a bit more political stagnation and the introduction of major parties and the introduction of the modern royal family, there was still a lot of unequal representation in government. However, we see this change in the 20th century with women earning the right to vote and everyone over the age of 18 being able to vote by the end of the century. This leads to the Sweden we see today, which has high political representation and high engagement from Swedish people, which allows the state to accurately, or at least hopefully accurately, represent the wants of its people. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us, and thank you for listening.